Now, Hamilton's a member of the Founding Fathers Club for two reasons, really. His participation in the creation and ratification of the Constitution and his fiscal proposals. And his public life is bracketed by two events: his meeting Washington and the death of Washington. The public may be more interested in the Reynolds affair and the duel, but what is important, is not always sexy. And so from all this research, what did we learn? Well, by allowing Hamilton and his contemporaries to speak for themselves, a picture emerges of a much more complex man than we had previously seen in historical writings. A lot of these findings flew in the face of the traditional picture of Hamilton as a monarchist and as an elitist. For generations, he was the least popular founding father. But as Syrett was fond of saying, of all the founding fathers, Hamilton, quote, belongs to the American present. And in the end, today, we are all Hamiltonians. He established precedents that affect the lives of all Americans still, including a centralized government, a balance of power foreign policy, deficit spending, direct intervention of the government in economic life, and a broad interpretation of the Constitution. Among the findings, he had advanced opinions on minority rights, perhaps the result of his experiences as a child or as a young adult in St. Croix. He held, and I quote, "the rights of every individual sacred," and held that no man be condemned or punished without regular trial and conviction of some crime declared by antecedent laws. In 1787, he denounced the loyalty oath for Catholics as a violation of the country's religious freedom principles. In 1787, again, he proposed a measure to ensure academic freedom in New York State schools. No president or professor shall be ineligible by reason of any religious tenet or tenets that he may profess, or be compelled by any law or otherwise to take any test oath whatsoever. He advocated emancipation during the Revolution. He said of African Americans, "Their natural faculties are as good as ours. The contempt we have been taught to entertain makes us fancy many things that are founded neither in reason nor experience." He supported popular government. At King's College, he wrote, "The only distinction between freedom and slavery is that in the former state a man is governed by the laws to which he has given his consent." Again, in 1787, "The fabric of the American empire ought to rest on the solid basis of the consent of the people." And as seen in the various congressional investigations into his conduct as Secretary of the Treasury, and in his own conduct during the revelations of the Reynolds affair, he showed that his public reputation for honesty was deserved and that honor was important to him, important above almost all other values. However, let us not skew our interpretation of him. He was also a ruthlessly ambitious man who found himself in the right place at the right time, with the right mentor in George Washington and the right marriage to Elizabeth Schuyler. He had a genius for the intricacies of financial planning, an unrivaled capacity for synthesizing arguments into political essays or legal documents, a weakness for rising to the bait of a challenge, a desire for military glory, and an unwillingness to compromise. In the first letter we had, which was to his childhood friend Edward Stevens in 1769, he ends it with, "I wish there was a war." From then, to his insistence on active military service in the Revolution, to his maneuvering Secretary at War Henry Knox out of the way so he could command the military during the Whiskey Insurrection, to his service in raising an army during the Quasi-War, to all of his duels, he sought military command and glory. He advocated emancipation, but then his mentor was a slave owner. And into all of this, in the summer of 1969, walked one very young graduate student looking for work. My summer job lasted 8 years. And I have a grudge against Burr because it could have gone on longer, and I would have been thrilled. There was nobody better to work for than Syrett. If we can take a minute just on the man. He was not just a true scholar, but he was a man who gave credit to the people who worked for him for everything they did. That note that Elkins and McKittrick wrote about my Reynolds affair occurred because after I had written that note, Syrett bumped into Eric McKittrick on the lawn at Columbia and spent 10 minutes telling him about this great note I had written, never once taking any credit for any part of it. He was an extremely fair man to work for, and he was very funny. I came on board in time for the whiskey insurrection of 1794. That was what they were up to in Hamilton's life when I joined. It was my first taste of Washington's wisdom and of Hamilton's military yearnings. It also emphasized his national view and his unwavering belief in the supremacy of the federal government. The prevailing popular assumption that Hamilton dominated Washington and influenced him to make decisions in Hamilton's favor was negated when I saw that before Washington issued his proclamation on the whiskey insurrection, he had sent copies of a draft to all members of the cabinet. And in the Washington papers, you will find all of the returned drafts with all of the comments by all of the different cabinet members. And then the final proclamation, so that you can follow the exact pattern of Washington's thinking, whose ideas he accepted, whose ideas he did not. The ability to trace, by the way, the evolution of policy like this is being lost in this internet world when you can do track changes and you can accept and reject and erase things. We're losing that whole thread of who actually influenced the final decision-making process. But in those days, it was easy to follow it. If Washington solicited an opinion, he kept 4 copies of that as he sent it out. Each of the people who received it kept a copy. Then they responded on a copy, and a copy was made of the copy. And in the end, we have about 16 copies of most official correspondence. So much of Washington's contribution in all of this is not appreciated. The least formally educated of the founding fathers, he had an instinct for balance, balancing people, balancing events, balancing opinions, in what he perceived to be the national good. Understanding that only he could unite and stabilize the young nation, he stayed on in 1792 for another 4 years. But by 1796, he was tired. He wanted to go back to Mount Vernon, and he also wanted to be sure that he ensured a peaceful transition of government to another president. This was an extremely important concept to Washington. I knew more about Washington's daily activities, from national policy to his instructions to his managers at Mount Vernon, to his advice about love and marriage to his step-granddaughters, than I really did of my own leaders. Hamilton's life became mine. I know the trees he wanted to plant at the Grange. I know what he spent on clothes, and I know he had a horse named Riddle. Because Riddle threw his shoe while Hamilton was on his way to the Supreme Court in Albany, and he was forced to stay at the Beekman Arms that night. When seen on a day-by-day basis, when you look beyond the big issues of the day that we all studied in school, the sheer volume of work that Washington and these 4 cabinet members put out was staggering, especially when you consider that almost everything they did set a precedent. From appointing everyone, from postmasters to lighthouse keepers, to doing a census in 1790, a fairly impressive one, to funding the debt, to establishing a bank, to creating a foreign policy, to responding to domestic crises. They brought a whole new government and country into being. And it's really amazingly impressive when you go through this day by day.